And I think having a relatively richer understanding of emotions, how they work, feelings, moral emotions, moral psychology, has helped in my conversations with kids and with the staff who work with them, teachers, counselors, clinicians, doctors. So it's informed how I speak to the individual I work with, which includes the kids. In one of the podcasts I was on, it was kind of reframed as second chances. All the kids I work with are second chance kids.
I love this.
Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Marc Hauser to the podcast. Marc is a researcher, educator, consultant, former Harvard professor, and author of the recent book, Vulnerable Minds: The Harm of Childhood Trauma and the Hope of Resilience. Dr. Hauser's scientific research includes over 300 published papers and 7 books, focusing on how the brain evolves, develops, and is altered by damage and neurodevelopment disorders. In this rich and important discussion, we talked about adverse child experiences, or ACEs, and why it's important to distinguish them from trauma. We also discussed Marc's new framework for thinking about the dimensions of childhood adversity and the challenges and promises of implementing the kind of approach he advocates for. This was an ultimately uplifting and hopeful discussion, and I'm really glad to see the work Marc is doing to help all kinds of vulnerable minds. So without further ado, I bring you Marc Hauser.
Marc Hauser. Wow. Welcome to the Psychology Podcast.
Lovely to be here.
Oh, wow. It's so good to see you.
Same.
What an incredible new book that you've written here that is covers a lot of themes that are very prominent in our culture today, such as adversity, challenge, trauma, and then you focus on where it sometimes matters the most in our childhood, right?
Yes, yeah. That's right.
So how many years now have you been working on the issue of childhood adversity?
So it kind of depends on how you answer the question of work on.
Right.
Because in many ways, my kind of research history has been heavily influenced by developmental ideas.
Yeah.
Going back to collaborations with Noam Chomsky and Steve Pinker, which are, of course, developmental issues, but evolutionary issues too. But in terms of the practical side of it, which is really kind of the new piece, about 14 years now working in schools. And of course, not all of it has been really on children with trauma histories, but children with different kinds of disabilities.
Well, that's right up my alley.
Yes.
I'm very interested in neurodiversity.
Yes.
And to what extent do you think neurodiversity, I didn't expect to start off with this question, but you got me thinking now.
Yeah.
Can neurodiversity be an outcome of adversity?
So I think in a sense that is often used today, the neurodiversity kind of movement or idea really has to do with how we think about disability in some ways. I think that's how I at least would frame it, and that we have a diversity of options that our genomes in some ways create, affected by how they interact with the environment. So traumatic experiences can certainly shape how we respond. And, I'm assuming we'll get into these ideas, but sometimes the traumatic experience can lead to what the psychologist Bruce Ellis talks about as hidden talents.
I love that stuff.
Which I really like as well. And sometimes, of course, it can really undermine real functioning.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought the Bruce Ellis work on that, because he actually draws a little bit on my advisor's work, Robert Sternberg.
Yes.
And talking about how some of these kids can develop practical intelligence
that
can go underlooked in our schools. So I'm sure you've seen that too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think what's come out of that work as a sort of a side effect in some sense, there's been some beautiful work on autism, where a lot of the cognitive biases that non-autistic individuals succumb to, autistic individuals do not. And that paints this very interesting picture. For example, some of the rational biases, like the famous bat and ball experiment of, $1.10, you get much fewer individuals who are autistic falling
for
that.
it. Yeah, they don't fall for bull.
No ball bat problem. And that, I think that's fascinating. And it paints an interesting picture about just, diversity of ways of viewing the world.
Yeah, I often think I might be a bit on the spectrum. I can't stand pretense. I'm allergic to pretense, But some people seem to love pretense. Yeah. It seems like most of the world. When I scroll through Instagram, I feel like I'm scrolling through a screen of pretense.
Yes.
What's going on? Why is pretense so alluring to humans?
I don't know the seductive nature of that. And I don't know if it's because the social media world has just sucked people into that universe so much. I think it's interesting that you say that you kind of have an allergy to it. It's interesting in the schools I work in, where there are some schools that have a very high proportion of individuals on the spectrum. It's funny, you'll see these kinds of kids kind of posing and doing all these things, and the autistic kids are just like, look, let's get out of here.
Yeah,
They don't want anything to do with it.
We're not big into small talk.
No, no small talk.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about ACEs, because it's a controversial topic within our field.
Yeah.
It's nice to sit with a colleague, someone who's in the same field as me. We can talk shop.
Yeah.
Some people have criticized the ACE research as too simplistic, and some have said, well, some of the stuff that's replicated. Can you kind of give me the latest, if there is any consensus at all in the field? What do you see as the biggest consensus about the ACE research, and the extent to which, particularly, it causes long-lasting, this is the key question, right? The extent to which ACEs early in childhood cause long-lasting changes in the brain that make it very, very hard to change in adulthood.
Yeah, good. So I think where I like to start is that I think the work that was in some sense published and brought to the fore in 1998 by Dr. Vincent Felitti and his colleagues put on the map the importance of adverse childhood experiences. Wow. It wasn't that people were not aware of the fact that adversity can shape development. I mean, this is an old topic, but the fact that it was brought to the fore in some sense for the medical community, who to this day, not necessarily asking about someone's childhood experiences, that was in some sense the shock to Felitti's experience, that he had never bothered to ask in his obesity clinic whether adversity was an issue. And it was brought to the fore by a patient who said, I had been sexually abused as a child. And so then he finds, of course, that 80% of the population of morbidly obese people in his population were sexually abused.
Incredible.
And that was a shock to his system.
I'm shocked right now.
Right
80%?
80%.
But that's not the general population.
No, not general population. Okay. But, and this is important, is he then goes and presents this work. And this is now in the 80s. He goes and presents this work to a group of medical people who are in the eating disorder area. So they're professionals, right? And he's effectively laughed off the stage. He said, come on, these people are making stories up because they're overweight. You don't believe that, do you? And then that night at dinner, a man from the CDC is sitting next to him and says, look, I don't know if you're right or wrong.
Why would overweight people logically be more likely to make up stories than non-overweight people?
That was the impression of the doctors, that if they're coming up with an excuse rather than the fact they've got an eating problem.
Trying to excuse it.
They're trying to excuse it away.
I see. Okay.
And so the CDC guy says, look, I don't know if you're right or wrong, but if you're right, we've got a real medical problem on our hands, and we need to find out. This is how the ACEs study was initially born. So they, test 17,000 people, not just the obese population, obviously, and they find, lo and behold, that ACEs are common, and they find that there's a strong correlation with some of the biggest health risks known to mankind. All right. That then quickly moves into the hands of the World Health Organization, which sort of spreads out this questionnaire globally. And fast forward, let's say, till 2010, 2020 or so, and we find that the following stats. The World Health Organization reports about a year ago that globally, annually, 1 billion children are maltreated every year.
In America? In where?
Globally,
global,
across
okay.
the world.
Okay.
We have 8 billion people.
Okay.
1/8 of those children. There's more children, I bet. That's a mind-numbing stat. Okay, and for me, that's the kind of crushing stats that when we get these things, please contribute to something. We want to hear about individuals. And for me, of course, I experience individuals who are like this daily. So that's kind of the replication issue at some level, that these are not part of dictatorships or democracies or heavily religious or non-religious or educated or not. These are global phenomena. Okay. Where I think things have gotten into trouble, and this brings it into the fore, is there's been a blending of ACEs with its effects. But ACEs, as the acronym says, is adverse childhood experience. It's not the response to the experience.
That's right.
So it's often confused with trauma, but trauma is the response.
I love that you said that.
Okay.
And I would even go one step further and say something a bit controversial. It's the story that you created based on the response to a real experience that happened to you. Yeah.
A story. And what I would add to it, and this is a distinction I make in the book, is that from adverse childhood experiences, some respond with trauma and some respond resiliently.
Most people, I think George Bonanno has found most people
Yes.
are resilient, and
Yes.
some even, dare we say, have post-traumatic growth.
Completely.
Yeah.
So there can be strength of growing at it. And we need to understand both.
Yeah.
What are the paths that lead some to be more vulnerable
Yes.
and others to be more resilient? And part of what the book does is it
Yeah.
pulls from the sciences to try to understand better what the sciences is telling us about that spectrum from vulnerable to resilience, which you can move across. Everybody can. But our biology is going to hand us some piece that's going to put us somewhere in that
So
spectrum,
glad you said that.
and then we're going to move.
I'm so the dirty word, the G word. You know, I in my new book
Yep.
I'm working on, I have a section called the dirty G,
G
word.
word, yes.
Because it's amazing to me the extent to which the trait neuroticism colors your world and
Yeah.
even makes it more likely that you'll label things as traumas.
Totally.
That someone who scores low in neuroticism is like, I wasn't traumatized. You could have two people
That's
in the same family,
Completely.
right? One who scores high in neuroticism,
Yes.
and one scores low, have the same experiences in childhood, being treated the same by the parent.
Correct.
And then you can find gross differences in one person's interpretation of their childhood as traumatic, and the
Absolutely.
other. And that's interesting, isn't it?
It's very interesting.
I'm even talking about like fraternal twins. You
Oh,
know?
completely.
Yeah.
That's right. And I think different experiences can also shape how we respond. I mean, there's a lovely kind of strategy that's often used in schools, but it should be actually used by anybody, which is it goes by the name, the size of the problem. So the idea is imagine three boxes of different sizes, a tiny one, a middle-sized one, and a big one. Okay. So when you're in a calm state, what would you consider to be a small problem? Right. And so you might model it and say, well, I banged my toe against the wall. It hurts, but it's temporary, tiny problem. Big problem. My mom's got cancer and is unlikely to survive. Okay. For me, painful experience, and so on. And then the middle is I've got a deadline. I'm going to go to a podcast with Scott and the traffic is killing me and I'm stressing out. I'm not going to make it on time. It's kind of middling sized problems. I have no control over it, which is also stressful. The thing is that as you experience different kinds of things in the world, those boxes can get reshaped. As you see, as for example, for me working in Kenya, where there's 3 million orphans in the world, and I see their experience, I go, my problems are never in kind of the big box relative to those kids.
Wow. You've worked with kids in Kenya?
So for the last 3 years, we actually have a nonprofit called International.
Do they
Children's
actually look
Bakery.
like what the commercials will make them look like? Yeah.
No.
Okay, talk to me.
So we'll talk about that. So sub-Saharan Africa, so the last sort of third of the continent, has 54 million orphans. Some of the biggest populations of orphans in the world. Kenya itself, a country of about 50 million people, has 3 million
Where
orphans.
do they put them all?
So these
Where are
are
the
in
orphanages?
orphanages. So there are almost about 1,000
Who funds
orphanages in
that?
Kenya. Not the government.
Right. Okay.
And so one of the things that we're doing is trying to bring resources to these places because, I'm sure we'll get back to this, part of the story about neglect and deprivation grows out of the incredible scientific work out of Romania, with Romanian orphanages. And in part as a result of that work, virtually all the orphanages in Eastern Europe were shut down because they were basically institutions. They were incredibly deprived children, as the 1990s Shame of a Nation documentary pointed out. They're like Nazi concentration camps for little kids. The difference is, it's important, is that in many low to middle income countries, these orphanages, which in Kenya they're called children's homes, are very different. You don't see kids who are gaunt and unhealthy and look like they're not going to be able to walk 2 steps. And in part, it's because you find these long-lived staff who stay with these kids, who become the nurturing parents effectively and enable those kids to grow. But the funding is coming from churches, from donors. It's really shoestring kind of budget.
Unbelievable. Thank you. You're elucidating me so much right now. Like,
Good.
I don't think most of us Americans know any of this shit.
They don't.
And we're blind to it. And maybe a lot more people would have a lot more compassion if we could take a trip over there. And
I think that's right. And I think, part of the angle of the book, which I know you're aware of as a psychologist, is that, psychology has had this experience that our population of study tends to be this weird, distorted population in some sense. And part of the angle of my book, which I think is quite different from most books on therapeutic traumatic issues, is it has a very strong cross-cultural lens. I'm talking about our species at some level. And I think that's important because strategies to help children have to be cross-culturally sensitive.
Well, that was actually going to be my next question. I love the extent to which you your book is different from a lot of other books in trauma by taking this cross-cultural lens. But, American culture, let's talk about America's obsession with trauma.
Yes.
Because there's TikTok trauma, which I think might be different than how psychologists define trauma.
Yep.
But now you have, every back pain, just every neurotic thought is now a trauma. Yeah. First of all, do you agree? Like, do you see it kind of getting a little bit out of control and far outside the realm of what we would call trauma?
I do. I think the word has become part of the colloquial language. It's become part of the common use of words. And I think it's interesting. I became to get your insights into this too as a psychologist. I think a lot of times in the sciences, when words that have a technical definition become part of the language, science tends to retreat and become almost more technical so that the layperson can't access the information. In some ways, my book is an attempt to kind of address that because the gap in terms of what we understand the sciences and what practitioners understand is monumental. So sadly, I think you're right that in this country especially, the word trauma has become kind of like part of the common lore. People use it. I think I described in the book. I had a friend of mine who I saw downtown when I was living in California, and he looked really out of sorts. And I said, "Hey, what's going on?" He goes, "It's the worst day of my life." I said, "Well, what happened?" He goes, "My son's soccer tournament was canceled." I'm like, if that's your worst day, I want your life. So that's a use of
no self-awareness.
About
that?
None, zero, right? So of course the term trauma in some ways, well, it's a Greek origin, but PTSD grew out of kind of the early 60s and the war veterans who were initially called just crazy.
Yeah.
And then of course it becomes part of the DSM in terms of PTSD and it has this technical term. And what's interesting there, and especially for you as a psychologist, is there's been some push of late, even of the DSM terminology, and for the reason of thinking about children. So let me give you an example. If you fall under the classifications of mental health issues in the DSM, that then licenses you to insurance coverage. If you don't, it doesn't, so it's now out of pocket. There are now many, many cases of children who have significant traumatic responses. You can see it physiologically, neurobiologically, but they don't fall under the criteria of PTSD. There are several psychiatrists and psychologists, Bessel van der Kolk being one, who have argued for a new diagnosis, which is called developmental trauma disorder, which is in particular for children. And here's the reason why I think it's important. I discuss this in the book. PTSD in the traditional sense is due to exposure to violence.
Oh.
A lot of traumatic responses are not necessarily due to violence. Children who have been severely deprived are heavily traumatized, and yet they don't count.
Yet neglect is not considered. Yeah.
Out. Attachment issues, right? Abandonment, right? But they're not necessarily violent.
Yeah.
And so they've been trying now for probably 10 years to get DTD, developmental trauma disorder, into the DSM, but the powers that be have rejected it, even though they've followed the guidelines for what counts as getting something in. So there's been a lot of controversy, which I'm sure you're aware of, that the DSM either puts in too many things or not enough.
Oh, I got a lot of issues with the DSM. Also, that it treats everything binary.
Yes,
you either have the disorder or not. And I'm friends with the task force trying to show the continuum that all these things are on. But I'm glad you brought up Bessel. Bessel, who was author of The Body Keeps the Score.
Yes.
I of course have a great respect for his long career, and he's done a lot for the field. But I kind of see the ideas in his book, or even just the notion the body keeps the score. Let's double click on that a second. Yeah. It's run amok in our society. Yeah. And people don't realize that that's not actually how it works. So the brain, like trauma is not like, let's talk about memory for a second. Yeah, memory is not stored in the body. This memory comes from the brain. And we can have, I prefer the term survival stress.
Okay, good.
And I wanted to see your thought, because I do like to give it in a nuanced way. I'm not like, trying to tear down. I'm trying to have more nuance around the idea, because it's too simplistic to have this notion that like the collective memory, the memory of our trauma is stored in our body, and our brain can't access it, and we're doomed forever. To me, that's a disempowering message. I think the truth is actually more empowering, the extent to which top-down processes, really can help influence our physiology, and and there are a lot of techniques. I'm a big fan of psychodrama, for instance.
Yeah, good.
My friend Dan Tomasulo is a leader in that. He's here in New York City, so shout out to Dan Tomasulo. But so I just think there's a kind of a disempowering message going around about trauma, that it's like there's this unseen force within your body that is causing everything you do, and there's really not that much hope in being able to access it, because it's in your body, not your mind. Yeah. But as George Bonanno told me over coffee once, I don't know if I'm allowed to repeat everything he said to me over coffee, but he's like, if you've had trauma, you remember it. Like, it's in your brain. it's not hit. If you've experienced trauma, it's not hidden. I mean, we're over that whole, Elizabeth Loftus, craze in the. I mean, I don't want to go back there.
Yes.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I do. No. So let's pull apart some of these pieces, because I think they're interesting in themselves. So I think there's a kind of a strong version of the body keeps the score, which I think many have interpreted as. Yeah. I think there's a weaker version, which is the more interesting version. The strong version is what you've painted, which is that there's a memory in my kneecap for, seeing my mom get hit by a car.
That's right.
Well, that's clearly false, because there is no memory system in my kneecap.
That's right.
But there's a more interesting version, which is that there's a body response.
Yeah, survival stress.
Stress, which includes the autonomic and the immune system.
Yeah.
And I think why I think that is critically important is because of two reasons. One, sometimes what we see operationally in an individual cognitively suggests no trauma, but the body is hammered. So here's a perfect example. This was a case that Felitti himself, talked about. Several years after he had published the original paper, a woman contacted him and said, "Look, I'm so glad to see this report. I am today a Seventh Court Circuit judge." So clearly, on every cognitive level, she has made it. Right? She's in her 50s. She was pimped out by her father as a kid, sexually, year after year after year. So this is one ace. Now let's keep that in mind too, because we'll come back to that ace score.
That one should count.
Well, let's come back to that.
More than one, yeah.
Let's come back to that, right? Because the ace score is about a number of different types.
That's pretty intense.
So we'll come back to that. Let's remember to come back to that. She was sitting on 4 different types of cancer.
Ugh.
Her immune system was completely destroyed, even though she was cognitively top of her class, judge. I mean, you name it. So I think the reason why I think that's important is because her body has kept the score of the trauma,
the stress,
in terms of the immune system.
Yeah.
In the same way that we see epigenetic tracking of things, right?
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
So I think it's the weaker but the more interesting part.
I agree.
And that's where I think Bessel van der Kolk's, and if I've been to many of the conferences he has in Boston, and the group, the heavy focus is on things like, EMDR, eye things, and yoga and breathing. It's all body work, because there is a sense in which there's a scarring to the body. Of course, there is scarring to the brain too, and that's where the memory is held. But I think we've not given enough attention to what's happening in the body. And many of the children I work with directly, they have no body awareness. They're talking to you, and what's happening is I can see their fist going like this. And they have no somatic awareness.
Yeah, I get it. I really do. I wonder how necessary it is for the word to think of it in terms of it's because of that one thing, that trauma, as opposed to, this is the way my body is right now, and let's change it, let's work on it.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like there's something in human nature that wants to understand, why am I the way I am?
Sure.
And I always get a little, I don't know, I wary when people want to reduce everything to that one event, to that one thing that happened to them. The one thing, the reason why I'm an asshole to everyone around me is because of that one thing.
Yes.
I get a little wary about that, because we're so multi-determined systems.
So, okay, that's a nice segue into this kind of one ACE idea. So,
okay.
You raised the question at the beginning of controversial pieces of the ACEs story. So the first one we've kind of tackled, which is that there's been a confusion about the experience versus the response. So we'll come back to that, but that's a key one. The second is that the ACE score is somehow indicative of the individual's potential problems. And there's two problems with that. The first is the originators of the ACE questionnaire, which was 10 questions about different types of adverse childhood experiences. That was never intended as a questionnaire about the individual. It's
really?
Never.
It was supposed to be about
populations.
Go into different populations and get a pulse on.
Correct.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Okay, and that's really important because in California, for example, it's been used by insurance to coverage. If you have an ACE score of 4 or more, you get a coverage which is different than less than 4. It has nothing to do with the individual, though.
That just blew my mind.
Yep.
Wow.
And we know from the science that the individual score is not predictive of what's going to happen to them.
Well, that's the key thing that I've seen criticized. I've seen very weak correlations.
Oh, it's really weak, and it's weak in two interesting ways. One is the ACEs questionnaire is a retrospective questionnaire. What happened to you, Scott, as a child?
Yeah, and that's so problematic.
And we know that's problematic.
So we know just how valuable memory is.
Completely.
Yeah.
So that's problem number one. The second problem is it assumes that the number of types is an accurate lens on health risks, as opposed to what I bring up in my book, which is different dimensions of adversity. So let's take apart some of these. The first is that they operationally define childhood as birth to 18.
Oh.
That's a pretty big swath of time.
Yeah.
As a psychologist, you're well aware that there are these different sensitive and critical periods for different things, and they're happening at different ages within that span.
Sure.
Okay. Just to give one example of something that's recent that we all experience, COVID hits. Who does it hit hardest? Teenagers. Why? Because the teenage years are a critical period for social interactions. They were deprived for 2 years of social interactions. Social interactions to teenagers are like milk to a baby. They're needed. And this has been well documented scientifically. So you have globally this massive response by teenagers to that deprivation. The mental health crisis, and I know you've had guests that have talked about this, has been pushed higher because of what COVID did to that teenage group. This is irrespective of cell phone, social media, and all the rest. It just bumped it up. We are seeing kids in school now who, let's say, are chronologically 14, who are actually developmentally like 9.
Hold on. So my brain goes to like the intelligence quotient and how it was originally scored. What would we call this quotient? It's an interesting question.
I mean, it's probably closer to EQ, but it's probably like SEQ, social emotional quotient,
it's
right?
Like where you are.
Yeah.
Emotionally developed. How emotionally developed are you?
Yeah, I mean, think about theory of mind. Our ability to interpret others' beliefs, and intentions, desires, and so forth. These kids were deprived of those critical periods.
Does this explain the crybabies on campus right now?
Yes, an over exaggeration.
They act like little babies.
Totally. Yeah. Well, that's actually it's funny, and it's also really potentially poignant because the adverse childhood experiences questionnaire stops at 18, but we know developmentally that frontal lobe is continuing to mature until about 23, 25.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the other piece of it that I'm going to add in today is that prenatally, we know that stress to the mother directly affects the developing fetus. Mm-hmm. And there was a study that was published last year. It was actually a fascinating study that was done with moms who were exposed to Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey. Mm. And they compared it with mothers who had their babies kind of before versus mothers kind of well afterwards. But here's what they found. They followed those babies up to the age of 5. Mm. Girls who were in the womb during Hurricane Sandy had 5 to 6 times higher rates of anxiety and depression, and boys had 6 times higher ADHD and oppositional defiance. Wow. Because of the stress of the mom.
Well, that's super interesting.
Right.
I wanted to actually double click on the notion of the gender differences. So I'm glad you kind of brought that up, because in the beginning you brought up PTSD and you brought up numbers like 1 billion have been, but I actually want to break it down by gender a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm continually amazed when I look at the striking gender differences in PTSD. Women really do disproportionately report higher levels of PTSD than men. Men have their own issues. Don't get me wrong. You know, like there are things with ADHD. We can autism. You know, we can bring up. Right. We all got our issues, but what do you think? What do you think's going on there, though? Like, why is that the case? Why do you say that gender difference?
So as a general cut, when you look at the kind of the mental health landscape, the broad, again, sex differences, a lot of variation, but as a broad cut, girls, women tend to be more internalizers. Yeah. Boys, men, externalizers.
Yeah.
And we certainly see that a lot.
Yeah.
But what cross-cuts some of that is also the type of adversity. For example, it's certainly not the case that boys are immune to sexual abuse, as we know from the church scandals.
That's important, right? To know that.
Yeah. But a lot of the understanding of sexual abuse has come primarily or more often from the female side.
Right.
So, for example, this is an incredible study that was done out of Germany. They showed that women who were abused as children before the age of puberty, as opposed to after, there's an area in the brain, in the somatosensory cortex, that maps to the genitals, clitoris in females. That area is smaller in girls who were sexually abused before puberty.
What's the implication of that for their own lived experience growing up as an adult?
So as adults, sexually averse, painful experiences during sex.
Less pleasure.
I see. Which has been documented, but now you've got this neuroanatomical landmark. Yeah. And as you, I'm sure, know, the somatosensory cortex in some ways is a map of kind of the body and the extent to which it's innervated. So, for example, our lips and our fingers have a massive space in that area. Our kneecaps do not.
Right.
And so the clitoris, obviously a heavily innervated area, is basically shrunk in girls who are before puberty. Again, pointing to that timing issue. It's not just adversity in type, but the timing.
Yeah, so I in Transcend I write about Teicher's research, TICHR, and some other research showing so clearly how depending on what kind of way you're maltreated, the brain has very specific ways it organizes itself to protect you from the emotional pain of it. But I went down a list of things. So you mentioned one, but we can mention other things.
Many types.
Emotional abuse.
Exactly.
And the amygdala does certain
Correct.
things. Yeah.
So the lens that I use in the book as a framework is what I call the adverse T's.
Okay.
T for the letter T, because there are 5 different dimensions of adversity.
Okay.
One we've already talked about, the type of adversity. The second is timing.
Okay.
The third is tenure, how long it lasts.
Okay. Not to be confused with academic
tenure.
Which can be abusive.
The fourth is what I call turbulence, which is the predictability or controllability of the adversity.
I see.
And the fifth is toxicity.
Oh boy, what would non-toxic abuse be?
Well, there's not. So there's no toxicity, but it's severity.
Which it is. Okay, I gotcha.
And one of the things I bring up in the book, which is kind of maybe topical today a little bit, is during the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
Matt Damon is coming, don't we want to distinguish between, a poorly timed sexual joke and rape?
Yeah.
And he got taken to town for that.
Yeah.
But of course we do, because it makes a difference in terms of how the body responds. Body and brain respond totally differently to a poor sexually timed joke, which can be certainly aversive, versus being raped.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, like, in a lot of ways, trauma is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, someone who you could imagine someone's lived experience being who has been raped and who is at a comedy club and hears a rape joke, and to that person in their unit, like everyone else around them is like, ah, but in her or his universe, like they're feeling a panic. And I guess in some ways a lot of it does come down to just like honoring someone's experience of something, and maybe that makes me sound really woke to say such a thing, but I am a big believer in, that kind of let there be a little subjectivity here.
Yep.
Where, like, I don't know what it's like for someone else to experience. I wouldn't even downplay or make fun of someone who has a visceral reaction to a joke that I find funny.
Yes.
I would probably still honor that person has that experience.
Yes.
I guess I would want them to also honor that I don't have that experience. So maybe it works both ways, is my point.
It does. Yeah. No, that's a very nice point. And it brings up something that's both a practical issue and then kind of an empirical experimental issue. On the practical level, of course, and this is the comedy about the woke piece, is that, everything's got a trigger warning nowadays.
Everything does.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's, of course, problematic in and of itself.
Yeah.
That said, as someone who works with children with significant traumatic experiences, one of my first experiences, this actually happened the first year I started doing this work. Wow. I walk into a middle school and this little boy bolts out of the classroom. And I was like, I don't think I did anything. And the teacher comes up, a lovely teacher, and puts her arm on my shoulder and says, "Look, I'm sorry, it's not you. You happen to just look like his father, who beats him almost every night."
Well, that's exactly.
Okay? So I was the trigger.
Yeah.
Okay. Next time I came to the classroom, I sat down on the ground and looked away from him. So I was smaller than him and I wasn't paying attention to him. And then he comes up to me and goes, "What's the matter? You're not going to talk to me?" But now I kind of calmed the unsafe environment down, okay, which is he needs to learn not to generalize that all men are not going to be abusive. Yeah. So it's kind of the reverse of typical psychology, where we want generalization for learning. With him, it's taking generalization away so he can feel safe.
Well, that's wonderful patience you had there to do that. Fear learning and fear unlearning operate in different parts of the brain.
Totally, completely different.
And so we have to learn. So
let me just the second piece, because I think it's critical what you asked. The toxicity level, of course, at some level, it is subjective. But here's where I think we've made progress. What you and I might consider to be neglect of a parent, and then you look at what's happening to these orphans, it's night and day.
Yes.
Right? However, one of the things that's come out of, for example, the work comparing the Romanian orphan children, which was really severe, toxic at the highest level deprivation, they had nothing. No stable staff, poorly nutritious food, constrained living quarters. I mean, you name it, it was the worst on a spectrum.
Yes.
Okay? But we know that socioeconomic scales mean something.
Yes.
And you can map people onto those, and you can see the effects on grades and attendance and all these other things. So there's an important piece of that dimension. And experimental work on animals, for example, has been able to experimentally titrate that to see what's kind of the minimal experience that one would need. And of course, the now thought of as horrible experiments by Harry Harlow were those experiments.
Yeah.
I mean, we may not like them ethically, which I certainly point out in the book, but they did try to titrate what's needed for a developing monkey to have functional social relationships. That's what that experiment was about, titrating deprivation.
Well, I mean, that was the part of your career was studying, right, monkeys.
That's
You were a professor at Harvard.
Yes. And
you were a big name in you studied morality, right? You studied morality, you studied monkeys. Something happened at Harvard. What happened?
What happened?
What happened to you?
What happened? Yeah. So, this is something that I really haven't talked about. My motivation for not talking about the misconduct case, which I do mention at the front of the book, was designed really in some ways on my part to protect my students. I had a very, very large lab. I wanted to make sure that what was ever happening to me, it went on for 5 years while I was at Harvard, that it didn't hurt them. And, I'm glad to say that all those students went on to have tremendous careers.
So is the implicit assumption there, so you're saying you didn't forge data yourself?
So what I own
Yeah.
as the head of a lab was that I was trying to do too much.
Okay.
I was not as careful as I should have been.
Okay.
With
So it's unintentional is what you're saying.
unintentional.
That's my direct question. Was it unintentional?
Unintentional.
So you didn't sit down one day and you're like, let me see how I can finance the state. Finance,
Nope.
finesse the data.
That's right.
You didn't do that.
I did not do that.
That's a big difference.
It is a big difference. And, I want to just note that when I think of the potential damage that misconduct can and has done, I think of two things. One, it causes researchers to invest time in looking at things that are false. And of course, it wastes taxpayer money, grants. Right? In my case, the case ended and I had to retract one paper. Several years after that paper was retracted, 2 independent labs replicated the actual result.
Interesting.
So I wasn't involved in those. Okay. They did them themselves. And so the result that we had was wrong because the experimental design was wrong and it led to a false conclusion.
Yeah.
But the actual result was actually replicated by 2 independent
So let me ask you just like a human to human question. Yeah. Do you feel like the punishment was too harsh for the quote crime? Because your career, right, took a big hit. I mean, this must be emotional for you, right? Because
yes,
you're a human who went through this. You're not just some sort of abstract entity that were like, oh, look at Mark. What was it? What has it been like
What's
for
it
you?
been like?
Yeah, I really care.
No, thank you for the question. I appreciate it. So I guess the first thing to say is that I resigned. I was not fired.
You weren't actually fired.
Nope. At the end of the investigation, the dean at the time said, this has not been your most shining moment, but you are still a member of our faculty.
I see.
And then for a variety of reasons, it just became not a place where I could really work. And for my own emotional sanity and for my family and my students.
Did you have like colleagues and friends who kind of turned on you, or?
Yes.
Or who you just lost?
Who I lost
as friends.
Who I lost as friends. However, as you probably know, and at the back of the book, some of my closest friends and colleagues, Steve Pinker and Susan Carey, stayed as friends, and they blurbed the book.
Yeah.
And I maintained friendships, and since that time happened, some colleagues asked me to come back to academia, and I decided I did not want to. In part because I had found this second chapter, which to me, to be totally honest, I probably wouldn't have found it because I certainly had plans of being an old fart professor at Harvard for the rest of my life.
You know what? You had post-traumatic growth.
I had post-traumatic
growth. Would you agree that that's like what happened to you?
Yes, I do. I do. And I certainly feel that in interesting ways, I didn't think I'd find something that I could do meaningfully that could use some of my skills.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it turned out that almost all of my skills have paid off in this whole new area.
How did the morality work you did then? How does that play a role in the work you do today at all? Yeah. Or are they really completely separate chapters of your life?
They're not completely separate because, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. One of the consequences of certain kinds of traumatic experience, in particular things like sexual abuse and physical abuse, is that it brings very strong moral emotions to the victims. Shame.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
And I think having a relatively richer understanding of emotions, how they work, feelings, moral emotions, moral psychology, has helped in my conversations with kids and with the staff who work with them, teachers, counselors, clinicians, doctors. So it's informed how I speak to the individual I work with, which includes the kids. And maybe it's had heightened level of compassion for others. I think, in one of the podcasts I was on, it was kind of reframed as second chances. All the kids I work with are second chance kids.
I love this. Well, this is personal to you too. You're a
is
second
totally
chance.
personal.
I'm giving you a second
Yep.
chance right now.
Completely.
By having you on the second.
Yeah.
So let's talk about hope. Let's spend the rest of this interview today talking about this toolkit that you've developed, and have you really seen examples firsthand of huge transformations in some of these kids and the way that they're sort of prospects in their head for their future?
Yes. Let me illustrate one.
Okay.
I'll give you two. This was a charming story in many ways. So I'm in this class. I'm teaching a class. So in a lot of the programs I work in, I teach a class on critical thinking. Because to me, a lot of these kids,
we need this.
They need this. They act too impulsively. They don't stop before they think, and think what to do. So I'm in this class, and we're talking about similarities and differences between humans and other animals. And we've talked about the similarities, and then the question that gets posed in this class about 10 or so middle school age kids, about 10 to 12 years old, is what's uniquely human? And this one boy leaps out of his chair and says, sentience. And I'm like, so I say to him, did you say sentience or sentence? And he says, what the fuck, Mark? Why would I say sentence? It's not even an answer to the question. I'm like, okay, my bad. I'm old. I can't hear that well.
How old is this kid?
11.
That's incredible.
Okay, so it gets better.
That's a future Steven Pinker right there.
So I say, okay, so my bad. I said, does anybody here know what sentience means? And they're crickets. I said, Charlie, can you tell us what sentience means? He goes, rolls his eyes. Well, okay, it's like kind of like the experience of what it's like to experience. Like, I can't really know what it's like to experience what you're experiencing, sort of really. I really can't know what it's like to experience what other animals are experiencing. But yeah, it's that feeling of experience. I'm like, that's really good. I said, where did you learn about that? He goes, YouTube, those guys. I don't know if they're philosophers or scientists, but like, Pinker, Dennett, Chalmers. I'm like, and my jaw drops. He's like, what, haven't you read them? This is a kid, complete deprivation and neglect at home.
Wow.
Parents with mental health issues. But through this program of people believing in him. Now, he had the biology of an incredible brain. But deprived and neglected, comes in filthy, doesn't wash. School does as best they can, but the school is there day after day. I give him books. He has grown over the last 3 years. He's now 13, 14. He's taking the high school class I'm giving on human rights and civics.
Wow.
And he's just blossoming because there's trust in the kids. So there are many, many cases like that. Similarly, in Kenya, where we're doing the work, 3 years ago, I went to an orphanage. A little boy had literally just been dropped off the doorstep, emaciated, almost no clothes, mute. Of course, didn't know the history. He was about 4.5 years of age. We came back this year to the same orphanage to put it in a library. This little boy is bright-eyed, talking, reading, playing.
Amazing, incredible.
So those transformations happen. They're slow, they're hard. But for me, where the next steps are is that a lot of the ideas, evidence that I cover in the book is not in the hands of practitioners. And that's what's sad.
Well, what does the toolkit consist of?
The toolkit. So the toolkit is really, for me, a broad swath of things for a couple of reasons. One is that, like almost in anything in life, there's not one shoe fits all. But the reason to really take that seriously is because these 5 different dimensions of adversity create what I call traumatic signatures. So in the same way that neuropsychologists have uncovered ways in which when certain parts of the brain are damaged, you get these signatures which indicate the cognitive deficit, the aphasias, right, prosopagnosia, face deficit, and so forth. Traumatic experiences can create other signatures that if we understand them, we can better respond with specific traumatic toolkits. For example, just as a simple cut, there's many more dimensions. What abuse typically does is it creates, and you mentioned the term before, it creates this hypervigilant amygdala.
Oh, yeah.
You are on high alert. The world is unsafe. Okay, so for example, that little boy who bolted when he saw me, he is like a gazelle on the savannah who sees a lion attack the group. The gazelle doesn't conclude that lion's bad. They conclude all lions are bad. And that's the right conclusion. Highly adaptive.
Yeah.
Okay. So they've overgeneralized adaptively. And what schools, therapists, parents, communities have to do is help tamp down that amygdala so that the world doesn't feel unsafe. Okay. Mm-hmm. So part of that work can be breathing methods, getting control over the breathing system, the size of the problem, types of stuff, other kinds of therapeutic work. So a whole variety of things to help tamp down so they don't generalize. Compare that with what happens with the lovely little child I mentioned before, sentience. He's deprived. He does not have a hyperactive amygdala. Deprivation undermines the development of the frontal lobe, and therefore the executive system. So the systems for learning, attention, short-term working memory, self-regulation.
Yeah, but he's listening to Pinker at age 11, though.
Yeah.
So how is that possible?
Well, that's right. Exactly. So he had a system that was designed to learn.
There's still some prefrontal cortex activity.
Totally working. Absolutely. Yeah. But for him, the association of actions and consequences were undermined. He wasn't getting the kind of feedback because the whole reward system was not really wired.
I see.
So for them, it's developing those systems of self-regulation. He flipped when I said sentence, right? Completely emotionally dysregulated in that sense, right?
I see.
And attention wasn't great, constantly looking around, right? So very different systems. So how do we design these systems so that we can nurture the pieces that need nurturing? So part of it are these social emotional, breathing, meditative, attentional work, sometimes medication, depending on how extreme the case may be. But one of the things I cover towards the end of the book is what I call the neuroengineering approaches. And many of these are not yet ready for prime time for kids yet, but they hold out hopes. Let me mention two. One of the techniques which has now been approved by the FDA for depression is transcranial magnetic stimulation. So this is kind of the magnet applied to the cortex.
GDSC.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And
as we call it.
Yep, exactly. Yes. And here's a result which I just love because it shows how understanding brain function with new technology can really begin to be moved into these applied areas. So consider populations of individuals that have had visually overwhelming traumatic experiences. So many traumatic experiences are not necessarily visual, but car accident, war veterans, where the visual input just floods the memories, nightmares, and they're constantly flooded and distracted to no end by these visuals. So there's an area in the kind of the back of the brain that my ex-colleague Steve Koslin spent decades uncovering, which is the visual imagery area. So you invite individuals with these kind of visually traumatic experiences to come in, and you invite them to bring back those images. And while they're doing it, you are stimulating the visual imagery area.
Incredible. Yeah, that's incredible.
And what you find is you basically fade the visual imagery component without losing the memory of the experience. So that now when it comes back, they're just not flooded as much by those images.
That's like a top down. That's what I was talking about earlier.
Exactly right.
It seems more hopeful to me.
It's much more hopeful.
Yeah.
So you also don't get the galvanic skin response because it's not causing that response.
Right.
So in some sense, yes, the body keeps the score, but it's coming out, the memory keeps the score, but the body is showing some of the outputs.
Well, that's what, in another way, Lisa Feldman Barrett says the body is the scorecard.
Yes.
The brain keeps the score and the body's the scorecard.
Exactly. That's right. Or I like the ledger concept.
I feel like that's similar to what you just said. Yeah.
Very similar. Yeah. So that's one. The second, of course, which has become part of the popular press, but I think I cover a lot more of the science in the book, is the sort of psychedelics revolution.
Oh, hello.
Yeah. And I think the key thing to kind of note here for your listeners, of course, is that it's not, let's just go have an LSD trip. It's therapy-assisted psychedelic use. It's not microdosing. It's therapy-assisted of a particular kind of therapy. And to me, what I love about the science is that it's beautiful science. And it's beautiful to me in the following way. So what they do are they call doubly blind experiments. So neither the patient nor the therapists know who got the placebo and who got the psychedelic.
Nice.
Okay. The second reason why it's beautiful science is because we're beginning to really understand the mechanism of how the psychedelics are affecting the brain.
Yes.
Okay. So in the case of major depression, it's psilocybin, magic mushrooms. In the case of PTSD, often complex PTSD, it's MDMA. So let me talk about the MDMA one, because I think I really like the hopefulness of this result. In both the depression case and the PTSD case, they're picking individual populations that are what are called treatment resistant, meaning they've gone for at least a decade where neither medication nor therapy has had any impact.
Must be really frustrating.
Really frustrating. So these are people at the end of their rope, right?
Of course.
They're just suffering all the time.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, horrible
I know people like that.
Yep, so do I.
Let's get them some help. Yeah.
Let's get them some. 8 weeks of MDMA and therapy knocks the PTSD diagnosis down by 70%.
Is that right?
That's why they're very close now to FDA approval, because they've gone through the key kind of criteria for getting FDA approval.
Hold on, this is super interesting. MDMA obviously operates in a different mechanism, a different system than psilocybin, for instance.
Yes.
And so they both have their own mechanisms of action.
Correct.
Do you think with it's like it has to do with serotonin sort of situation going on there? Yeah.
Serotonin and potentially oxytocin, and this comes from animal work. So this is a really, really cool result. So this is a guy named Roman Nardu, who's a kind of neuroscientist, who's actually used MDMA with mice. Obviously, there's no therapy.
Do they start hugging each other
Yeah.
more? And dancing?
Yes. Here's the really cool thing. You reopen the critical period for social interactions in mice with
That's
MDMA
incredible.
and oxytocin.
That's incredible.
So this is where the combination of work with animals and humans is really beginning to shine the light on what's going on mechanistically.
Yeah.
And that opening of the critical period is the key part, because, of course, people who take MDMA ecstasy at parties, it's because of the social stuff.
Yeah.
And that's what it's doing. It's opening up that sociality, which, of course, and critically, is opening it up to therapy. In the same way that psilocybin in depression, major depression, the default network, which is kind of the autobiographical piece, is taking the first position in our thinking for depressed people. That's why they can't get out of their own way. It's like, why am I always so sad? Why am I always so sad? Right. What psilocybin does is it quiets that system down and opens up other networks like the salience network, making the individual more open to therapy.
The self is such a source of our suffering, isn't it?
Yes, it is. You'd rather be in aplesia.
Say it again?
I'd rather be in aplesia. No self.
Oh, no self. That's yeah. I mean, when you think of just our self narratives and how that kind of creates wars. I mean, not just internal strife, but
Yes.
it explains a lot of strife
It
around the
does.
world. But I also think the default mode network is really good for creativity, though.
Absolutely.
So I've published studies showing that
Yes.
it can have. It's not all bad. The
It's
default
not all
mode-
bad.
I call it the imagination network.
Totally. Yeah,
yeah.
that's right.
Hey, this was such an elucidating conversation and so important. I can tell that you are. I'm glad I met you. You're not the villain that you've been made out to be at a certain point in my life when you were made out to be.
Yeah.
I'm glad I met you. You are obviously so compassionate and you get authentically emotional when you talk about helping these kids. I am sitting right next to you and I see it,
Oh, thank
and it's
you.
so authentic and it's just it's beautiful.
Thank you.
So thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you for the conversation. It's been awesome.
Yeah.